This is the information station, AM 1440, KUHL, Santa Maria.
Making you smarter one day at a time. This is the Andy Caldwell Show.
I'd like to welcome you back to the show. We're going to get Tom Harris on the line here in just one moment. Tom has 30 years experience as a mechanical engineer and project manager, a technical trainer, and a science and technology advisor to a member of Canada's Parliament. He's been trying to create a sensible approach to energy and environmental topics, and he's widely published. We're going to be talking to him about a number of issues. Tom, welcome back to the show.
Yeah, hi, Andy. Good to talk to you.
Thank you so much. Well, I really like these pieces you wrote, one of them for the Washington Times and the other one for the Fayette Tribune. And I've seen this phenomena before, and we should talk. I want to talk about it. And one of the things that you're talking about is that the point of the spear right now is on coal. And they're literally destroying the coal industry. And why don't you tell us a little bit about, tell us a lot about how they're destroying the coal industry. And then we're going to talk about how the other energy sectors are kind of glad it's not them, and they're trying to make a buck at the expense of coal. But you're saying that that's penny wise and pound foolish, and we should have a coalition stand against these extremists.
Yeah, exactly. It's really unfortunate. Right now, the main weapon of extreme environmentalists is the climate scare. The idea that not only do we know what the future of climate is going to be in 50 years, but that we are the major controllers of it. Now, of course, we don't really know that, but that is the politically correct point of view. It turns out that coal puts out more carbon dioxide than its competitors, for example, natural gas and nuclear. They actually put out considerably less. So it's easy for the climate activists to attack coal. And, you know, the sad thing is that natural gas and nuclear people and hydroelectric people, too, they generally are helping them by saying that, look, our sources produce less CO2. And the whole point is that they don't seem to realize that groups like the Sierra Club are out to kill them all. And, you know, just a couple of weeks ago, before they took it off their website, which is what they did after I publicized what the Sierra Club were saying in their energy resources policy, they called it, that was adopted by their board of directors in October of last year. They had a list of resources opposed by the Sierra Club. And you just laugh, Andy. There's not much left after you go through this list. They are against coal-fired power plants, coal bed methane, oil shale, oil sands, new offshore oil drilling, synthetic natural gas, new natural gas electricity generation, hydraulic fracking, nuclear power plants, new large hydroelectric plants. So, I mean, basically, what do you have left? You don't have much left. You have things like wind and solar power, which, you know, are unreliable and very expensive. You have immature technologies they say they support, like ocean power, and someday we may get power from the ocean through waves and things. And, of course, they talk about small hydroelectric. It's okay if you dam up, you know, small rivers and get run-of-the-river type hydroelectric power. But, you know, none of these can replace our primary energy sources in the near future. California gets more than half of its electricity from natural gas, and another 20% from nuclear, another 20% from hydro. You're only getting something like, when you actually look at the total amount delivered, and I'm not talking about capacity, you're only talking about perhaps 1/20th of your power coming from wind, about a little less from solar. I mean, we're really not talking about a lot. And so if you get rid of your primary energy sources, you're in big trouble. And that's what, unfortunately, groups like the Sierra Club are trying to do.
And, of course, recently I wrote an op-ed, a guest editorial for the Santa Barbara News Press that, you know, Abengoa, Sun Edison, and the Ivanpah facility in California all going into bankruptcy.
Oh, yeah. And you look across the United States, coal companies just on April 14th, for example, Peabody Energy Corporation, the world's largest private sector coal company, they filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. And, you know, that follows a whole list of American coal companies that are going bankrupt. And, of course, well, as it says in my article in the Fayette newspaper from West Virginia, over half of the mines and miners in central Appalachia are now idle. Okay, so I mean, there's massive unemployment, and yet the United States is the Saudi Arabia of coal. I mean, people don't realize this, but you have enough for centuries, and with modern technology, you can burn it quite cleanly. However, taking carbon dioxide out of the coal, that's very expensive, and we really don't know yet whether we can do it on a national scale. MIT did a study a few years ago saying that to actually show whether the technology of storing carbon dioxide underground, they call it CO2 sequestration, to show if that was even feasible on a national level would require 10 demonstration plants operating across the U.S. for 10 years. So we don't even know if that's possible.
Now, see, this is what kills me. The coal industry, as you mentioned, is our most plentiful and least expensive source of energy. And there has been some technological gains on being able to burn it more cleanly and more efficiently. Yet the government keeps putting out these mandates and standards that are forcing them all out of into bankruptcy and out of business. In the meantime, the solar and wind doesn't put out enough, but we subsidize it. We mandate that the utilities buy it, and yet they can't, even with that business model, stay in business.
Oh, yeah. Well, the price at the bus bar, where you actually get the electricity, is a good 5 times more for solar and wind power than it is for coal. And like you said, we can clean the coal emissions. We can take out real pollution without any particular problem. This is very worrisome for countries like Canada as well. You might wonder why somebody from Canada would be interested in how you generate electricity in the U.S. I mean, the main trade advantage that the United States has had with Europe over the years has been your very, very inexpensive electricity. And that has led to, a much more prosperous country. You can afford much more military. And we in Canada, of course, greatly benefit from that because you are basically the defenders of the free world. So when we see the United States crippling itself by massive increases in electricity prices, which are going to happen. And by the way, Andy, I'll give you an example of what happens when you get rid of coal and you follow things like the Clean Power Plan. In Germany, if you follow the same trajectory as they did, you're going to see American electricity prices go up by a factor of 4, 400%. I mean, they talk about a 35% rise due to the CPP, but the Clean Power Plan, Obama's plan, that's only the tip of the iceberg. They want to go much further on this. And the really crazy thing about this, Andy, is that even if you thought humans were controlling climate change, what the United States does is going to have very little impact on the world because China and other developing nations now put out more greenhouse gases. And yet, this was put right to Gina McCarthy, the head of the Environmental Protection Agency, in one of the House of Representatives hearings recently. They said, how much impact will the Clean Power Plan have on global climate? And McCarthy was forced to admit that it'll have virtually none. It's so small, it's hardly measurable. So they said, well, why are you doing it? This is obviously going to hurt American industry and especially the poor, by massively increasing your electricity prices. And her answer was because the American government wants to set an example to the world for the world to follow. So this is all symbolism. The actual impact of the Clean Power Plan is virtually nil.
Let's talk about the Appalachians. I mean, the bottom line, that without those coal plants, that was, one of the original most impoverished populations in America, poor, impoverished, no education. Coal is one of the only things that ever kept them going.
Oh, yeah. And you see many of their communities where coal not only keeps them employed, but it also pays for their schools and massive contribution to their taxes. I mean, 95% of West Virginia's electricity comes from coal. Same thing for Kentucky. All through that region. You got Alabama, you got Montana, you got Wyoming, you got Utah. All these states are heavily, heavily dependent on coal. But I guess they don't have enough influence in Washington because the bottom line is they will all be crippled. Your electricity rates will skyrocket. One thing to realize is take California, for example. You only get about 1% of your electricity from coal. Okay? Now, California is the 4th most expensive electricity rates in the United States. You go to places like Wyoming, you have extremely low electricity rates because they're using coal. And so, I mean, this is a very expensive activity, all for the sake of symbolism. And yet then you have to say, well, will this symbolism work? Will China really follow the agreement that was signed on Friday at the United Nations? Well, the answer is almost certainly not, because the foundation of all UN climate agreements is something called the Framework Convention on Climate Change. And it states point blank, not just in one, but in 2 places, that not greenhouse gases, but development and pulling their people out of poverty is the main focus and the main first and overriding priority with the words they used. Those are the priorities of developing nations, and they are not going to pull their people out of poverty if they stop building the cheapest form of electricity generation, and that is coal. So they're simply going to say, no, we're following the UN treaty, and we don't have to hit the emission targets. They even cornered the Chinese representative in Peru a couple of years ago at one of the UN conferences, and they said, are you going to renegotiate the foundation of the UN climate treaties, which is the FCCC? And he said, no, our objective here is to enforce it, not to change it.
But
so
bottom line,
this is a hoax.
It's a redistribution of wealth is all it is. Jobs and wealth.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Tom, we're going to take a break. Our guest, Tom Harris, he's an Executive Director, International Climate Science Coalition. You're listening to the Andy Caldwell Show. We'll be right back with more of our interviews. Stay tuned.
Online worldwide, but heard right here. This is the Andy Caldwell Show.
I'd like to welcome you back to the show. My guest, Tom Harris, he's Executive Director, International Climate Science Coalition. And Tom and I are talking about the coal industry and the devastation of the economy in a lot of these coal states. And Tom, one of the things you mentioned, some of these states get 90% of their energy from coal. Where are they going to get it when these plants are shut down?
Well, of course, the natural gas people say that they're going to get it from natural gas. The trouble is, while the U.S. currently has a lot of natural gas because of fracking, they don't have the infrastructure to actually get the natural gas around to places that currently are using coal. I mean, we already have the infrastructure for coal. We have barges on the Mississippi that are going up and down all the time. They have trains and all sorts of things. Now, those things are very solid infrastructure. So, I laugh with my American friends. I say, well, it's a good thing that the United States doesn't have any debt. Because you're going to have to spend $1 trillion or more just building a new infrastructure to replace an energy source that is already there. So I mean, this is really crazy. To a large extent, using natural gas for generating baseload electricity, that's kind of like a reverse Midas touch. In other words, it's like changing gold into lead. I mean, coal is a very solid, dependable fuel for baseload electricity. Natural gas, of course, is a very special fuel. It can be used for heating homes. It can be used for all sorts of purposes that coal is no longer used for. So we should save our natural gas for the things that it's specially good for. We shouldn't try and waste it on just generating baseload power when we have lots of coal across the country.
Well, and as you mentioned, they don't have the distribution infrastructure available in some of these places because they have been using coal. And my question is when is this all going to hit the fan? Will it be next winter? As soon as that?
It really depends on what kind of a winter we get. It depends what climate experts you believe. If you look at a document called the Non-Governmental International Panel on Climate Change, NIPCC, you can check it out at climatechangereconsidered.org. What they show is that some scientists actually say we're headed for global cooling because they say that the sun is a more influential driver of climate than anything we could possibly do, and the sun is going into a weak phase. Now, if that's true, and the Russians say that we're headed towards that weak phase, we've already started, we're going to get colder and colder winters. And that is going to be a very big problem. We're actually going in the same direction as England. I mean, England has a situation where many of their senior citizens die every winter because they're faced with basically what they call eat or heat. They can't really afford to do both. The other day, the Prime Minister of Britain was saying, and this was his exact quote, if you excuse the phraseology, it's not very polite, but he said, we have to get rid of this green crap. That's what he said, because he knows, and many people in England now know, what happens if you follow things like the Clean Power Plan to its logical conclusion, and that is that you have no more coal. Eventually they're going after natural gas because the Clean Power Plan only treats natural gas as a transitional fuel, okay? It's not a final objective. And of course they're talking about regulating methane because of climate concerns. So indeed, groups like the Sierra Club, they want to put them all out of business. They want to basically bring us back to a much lower level society, and that's not something that you can afford. You can't really support the kind of population you have on wind and solar power. So I think the long run of this is going to be mass blackouts across the United States, and a reduction to a second world status. I think it's going to be very dangerous. I think the main objective in this, quite frankly, is to bring the government into control of more and more of the energy infrastructure. The coal sector has been one of the most successful private enterprise endeavors in American history. I mean, it's been very successful. They don't need government help like the wind and solar industry, and I guess Obama doesn't like that. The impression I get is that Obama thinks that the government can run the electricity sector better than private enterprise. And so he's basically make it so that the successful private enterprise in the coal sector will be phased out, and the heavily government-dependent sectors like wind and solar will become, the favored choices. And that is indeed, I think, what the objective here is. I think it's to basically make it a government-controlled energy infrastructure.
Well, that makes entirely good sense. The other thing, I went visited Detroit a couple years ago. People don't understand the connection between the coal and steel industry and the auto industry.
Oh, yeah. Coal, and for coking, for actually making steel, that's an incredibly important resource. In fact, that's one of the main uses of coal is coking, as they call it, for making steel. Obviously, if you make the cost of coal higher and higher and higher, not only does it cause them to close down coal stations, but the coal producers, they'll be paying more and more in carbon tax and things like that, so your steel prices will go up. So will things like cement production, because cement actually produces an enormous amount of carbon dioxide. So, are you going to import your cement from China? Obviously not. What you're going to do is you're just going to pay a great deal more for your steel and for your cement. And that's really sad, because the United States, a friend of mine, actually my cousin, is a specialist in bridge design, and he says that a third of all the American bridges are in need of repair right now. There's massive construction work that's needed in this kind of an area, and that's going to require a lot of steel and concrete. Again, the price is going to soar. So this is deadly.
Absolutely. Now, one of the things that you've written about, and I totally agree on this, is that, like, for instance, the natural gas industry is saying, hey, look at us. If you don't want coal, look at us. The nuclear power plants ought to be should be the darlings of the environmental movement, because there's no emissions at all in terms of greenhouse gases. But the fact of the matter is these guys are not hanging together, so they're going to hang separately.
Oh, yeah. One of the main objectives at the very beginning of Greenpeace was anti-nuclear. So, that is actually a bedrock environmental position. They're never going to support nuclear power. And they really don't support large hydroelectric as well. And hydroelectric, it's hilarious, because they'll go to hearings and they'll say, oh, we don't put out any greenhouse gases. Well, that's not true. Not only does it require manufacturing these enormous dams, which of course puts out a lot of carbon dioxide when they're doing it, but when they flood enormous areas to actually dam up the rivers, it releases a great deal of methane, okay? And the funniest thing, Andy, is that in fact the primary greenhouse gas in the atmosphere is actually water vapor. So if you hold a lot of water up high in reservoirs and you don't let it drain to the ocean, you actually get a lot more water vapor evaporation. And, a friend of mine is an expert in water resources, and he says if the government was really serious about reducing greenhouse gases, they would then drain our reservoirs, because that alone could make the difference between, let's say, Canada meeting the Kyoto Protocol and not. So, indeed, all these energy sources are at risk if they continue to support environmental extremism.
The bottom line here is, if we talked about cradle-to-grave impacts of manufacturing and disposing of batteries, solar panels, and wind turbines, and then we talked about the deaths to bats and birds from wind turbines, funny thing is, there's no such thing as being able to create something without impacting something.
That's right. There's no free energy source when it comes to pollution. You will produce pollution when you make energy. And so the question is, what is the most efficient way to produce energy that produces the least real pollution? It's really quite funny, because the companies in China who make the wind turbines use coal to power their factories. So, indeed, you don't get away from pollution by simply using wind and solar, but what you do is you introduce a lot of new problems, A friend of mine lives only 550 meters from a 61-story wind turbine that was just put in southern Ontario, and it's miserable. The infrasound that vibrates their house all day long. This is the kind of direction you go if you get rid of your cheap and efficient energy sources like coal.
Well, it's absolutely amazing. Of course, here in California, we lost one of our only two nuclear power plants, and people would like to shut down the last one. And lo and behold, though, some people finally figured out that nuclear power plant, Diablo, in San Luis Obispo County, has a desal plant, and that we could solve two problems at once, energy and water. In my opinion, they should be building these things like crazy along the California coast.
Yeah, and yet as a result of the Chernobyl accident, the Russians didn't shut down that kind of reactor, that had a graphite moderator. It was the American and Canadian reactors that were slowed down, and largely because of Jane Fonda and the whole anti-nuclear movement. So indeed, nuclear reactors, you build a nuclear reactor in China, a CANDU reactor, Canadian reactor, in only 5 years. From the initial attempt to get it to having it approved and built, takes 5 years to put on electricity. But in Canada, it takes 10 years because we have so many environmental barriers to go through. So, the nuclear is obviously part of the solution, as is coal. But for a lot of the United States, if you're sitting on top of it, well, why not use it? It's right there, and it's easy and cheap to use.
Now, we only have less than 30 seconds, but I think I read that an Ohio State University was coming up with some way that they think they could use coal with no emissions at all.
Yeah, well, there's actually a number of approaches to taking out the carbon dioxide. But what happens, of course, Andy, is it actually increases the pollution, the real pollution, because they have to then build carbon dioxide pipelines to pump it across across the United States to find places where they can store it underground. Well, and of course, if it ever leaks, it all comes back into the atmosphere anyway.
We could use it in greenhouses. They love carbon.
Oh,
hey,
yeah, exactly.
Tom, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Andy.
All right, Tom Harris, International Climate Science Coalition. You're listening to the Andy Caldwell Show. We'll be right back. Stay tuned.
This is the information station, AM 1440, KUHL, Santa Maria.